Hello there, my name is Ben Bayer. I'm a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and with me today is Onkar Ghate, who's the Chief Content Officer at the Ayn Rand Institute. Today is the second in a series of webinars that we're doing reviewing Ayn Rand's Ford Hall Forum talks, which were recently uploaded to ARI Campus. And we are encouraging people to take a look at that new material that's on campus. And to that end, we are trying to highlight a few things in those talks that you might have missed to encourage you to take a look again if you haven't already, maybe to take a look for the first time. So, like I said, we're doing these webinars to draw your attention to this new material that's available on ARI Campus. And another interesting thing about the talk that we're discussing today, of Living Death, which is, of course, about Pope Paul VI's Encyclical Humanae Vitae, is that it's the 50th anniversary of the release of that talk, of that encyclical, and also, I think, therefore, the 50th anniversary of this talk. So that's a point that has not gone without comment in the news media. The encyclical that the Pope released that year was very controversial for its time, including and especially among Catholics, because there were a lot of Catholics who took exception to the Pope's rigid restrictions against birth control. And so it's always been a point of contention within the Catholic Church. But of course, the Catholic Church has also been at the forefront of pushing for legislation to restrict the use of birth control, and of course, especially abortion, not just for Catholics, but for everybody, wherever they have any kind of political pull. And so this is a topic that is of perennial importance, not just for people who have any history with the Catholic Church, but for anybody who lives in a country that's affected by them, and anybody more broadly than that who deals with the issues who deals with the issue of living in a culture that's highly influenced by religion and has similar kinds of strictures against birth control. So there's a lot to talk about today, and we're not going to be able to talk about everything, but we did come up with a list of some things we think that are interesting to highlight. I wanted to start out just by looking at the very first paragraph or the very first passage of the talk, and I'm looking at the transcript of it that was published as an article in the Objectivist. And she starts out by saying, "Those who wish to observe the role of philosophy in human existence may see it dramatized on a grand and gruesome scale in the conflict splitting the Catholic Church today." And so this is, I think, another one of the things I think that makes this a really interesting talk, that she's using it not just because she's got an axe to grind with Catholic philosophy and wants to criticize it. She's discussing this controversy in the 60s, and which has continued to this day, among so-called conservative and liberal Catholics, to illustrate the role of philosophy. And this is something that the role of philosophy in life, and the role of philosophy in history and in our culture, and something that she's often trying to sell her audience on, that it's not just a bunch of academic questions unrelated to daily life. Here's a case where you have an avowedly and self-consciously philosophical institution that is drawing out the implications of what it means to act on a philosophy consistently, and what it means to take certain ideas seriously. And she's showing what this means in practice. And she's also doing something she often does when she talks about the role of philosophy, which is not only to show what it means to live by these ideas in practice, but to talk about what it would mean, what kinds of psychological motivations would lead someone to want others to act on these kinds of ideas in practice. And so there's a couple of different ways that this happens in this talk. She starts out very close to the beginning, giving a sort of mini, bear in mind what this subject entails. Try to hold an image of a horror spread across space and time. That passage, she's telling a little story about what it would mean to take these ideas seriously. This is something similar to what happened in the in the anti-industrial revolution talk, which you discussed last week with Aaron Onkar, she also gave a little story of what it would mean like to live according to the ideas of the environmentalists. And then she goes on later to talk about the issue of motivation of the church. And that's something I want to come back to later in our discussion.
I think it's also worth thinking about the cultural context here and why she's writing on this. But let me just step back. Ben, you said, so one of the goals here is for people either to revisit an Ayn Rand talk, an Ayn Rand lecture, or an Ayn Rand article, if you've read the article instead of listening to the talk. And if it's your first time coming, these talks are, so it's sort of your first exposure to Ayn Rand or to Ayn Rand's nonfiction writings. These talks, I think, are good things to start with because they're addressed to not a specialized audience, so these are all given to the Ford Hall Forum, nor to an audience that is especially familiar with Ayn Rand's philosophy, though there certainly were, if you listen to the Q&A, there's people who know quite a bit about the philosophy, but there's total newcomers as well. So they're accessible and they're interesting in that way. And if you're trying to learn about Ayn Rand's ideas, there's the saying in real estate, it's location, location, location. And here it's read or listen to Ayn Rand, listen to Ayn Rand, and listen to Ayn Rand, both to get the content and to get her approach. I think you get her methodological approach and the way she looks at issues. And I think that's interesting here in terms of why she's writing on this, that it's not, the way I put it is she's not sort of sitting in a room waiting for the next encyclical so that she'll have something to write about what's wrong with what the Catholic Church is saying now. It's rather that this was, at the time, a really big cultural issue. So the issue of the pill and contraception, just think of it outside of the church. This was a big issue in the culture at the time. And my view, and I think it's Ayn Rand's from what emerges from this article, is this is an enormously great productive achievement, the pill. It's one of the great things of the 20th century, this invention. So there's that issue, but then there's this struggle with people trying to understand what is the view of the Catholic Church. And the previous encyclical, the English translation of The Development of Peoples, caused a lot of controversy in the news media. You find editorials, and if you read Ayn Rand's article, Requiem for Man, which is dealing with that encyclical, she quotes from newspaper editorials, opinion pieces of people trying to understand and make sense of that encyclical. And then you get this second encyclical, and the two seem to conflict. And people are sort of throwing up their hands. We've got to take this seriously, but we don't know how to take it seriously. We don't know what to do about this. And so if you think that in that context, then her motivation is, you can't understand what is going on here unless you look at it with a philosophical lens and a philosophical perspective. And that's what she's then trying to do for her audience. That's what she's bringing to the analysis. It's her unique philosophical perspective, but just of looking and taking seriously philosophical ideas. And part of taking seriously philosophical ideas is what you were bringing up, Ben, is that you think of what they actually do to an individual human being if that person acted on them.
It's interesting you mentioned the point about the birth control pill. I think that part of that same cultural context is this is the late 60s, and so you've got the counterculture and you've got the free love movement. And you see, if you read the encyclical, I can't remember if she quoted these passages, but you definitely see the Pope concerned with the fact that there's this promiscuity about in the culture, and sees basically his philosophy as the only alternative to it. And interestingly, in the commentary that I've read on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of this, a number of writers sympathetic to the church have have said, well, we told you so. This is, they look at the contemporary scene today and of sexual mores and culture, and they think that the promiscuity, the sexual promiscuity that began in the 60s has now run rampant, and that if only we had listened to the Pope, things would have been better. Now, at one point I want to come back to talking about the church sexual abuse crisis, because I think that maybe tempers that bit of wisdom somewhat. But it's an interesting question, and I think we plan on getting into this. Is the church's philosophy of sex and love the only alternative to the promiscuity of the 60s, or is that a straw man to say that? And of course, Rand has a fair bit to say in the talk herself about how she thinks that there is another alternative, and she lays out some of her own positive views about love and sex. So while we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, and we are encouraged, if you're just joining us, we do encourage you to add questions to the Facebook chat or to the Zoom chat about the material we're discussing, or if we're not talking about it at the moment, if you had another question from another part of the Of Living Death talk that we haven't gotten to, please let us know. So I mentioned earlier, Onkar, that I think aside from the fact that she goes into a lot of detail about what it would mean to take seriously, for example, this mind-body dichotomy, and what it would mean to take seriously the idea that God is the Lord of the universe and the Lord of life, and that morality is dictated by him, including sexual morality. In addition to thinking about what that means to act in accordance with, there's also a lot that she says in this speech about kind of the church's motivation for wanting people to act on this idea, and presumably its own motivation for wanting to act on this idea itself. And this is one of the things about the talk that I find the most fascinating. For one thing, I think the first few times that I read this or heard this, I really didn't appreciate what she was doing here. And the more that I've studied her, and the more that I've read her other essays, the more I see her doing the same kind of thing in a lot of the way she approaches and analyzes cultural issues. And it's interesting because on the one hand, if she's right about it, it's profound. But on the other hand, it's a tricky question to know if she's right about it. I mean, how much evidence do you need to have? Can you have any evidence to speculate about, the psychological motivations of another person, let alone an institution? And I mean, she does give evidence. I mean, she basically argues that the reason that the Pope and the Church as an institution want people to follow this advice, that forbids the use of birth control, is because they want people to lose their self-esteem. They want people to cower. They want people to hate life and the pursuit of happiness, basically. And I mean, I think when a lot of people read this, maybe for the first time, if they're paying attention, they're gonna wonder, well, that's quite a statement. I mean, that's quite a claim, and some would say it's a calumny on the church. How can you know that this is what they think? Why not take them? Why not assume some kind of innocent motivation on their part, like they really just want to get people to heaven, and this is the way to get them there? But she does give evidence that this is their motivation. And it's an interesting question of, whether this evidence is good enough. So, I mean, one major piece of evidence she gives is that it's the view of love and sex that the church describes is not one that values love and sex for their own sake. It regards it as a means to an end, and it's only justified as a means to an end. And the pleasure that people take in sex is, at best described as a kind of accidental, side benefit that some people may be lucky enough to enjoy, but it's not something that anybody should be able to enjoy by right. And that's, built into the idea that there's these procreative and unitive functions for sex. And there's a particularly interesting piece of evidence, I think, and it took me a long while to figure out, I think, exactly what she was saying about this, is the point that she makes about the rhythm method, which is really interesting because, the way that she puts it at one point is, on its face, this doesn't make any kind of sense at all. Because if the purpose of this prohibition is that there's this unitive and procreative function to sex, well, wouldn't it be that you should not have sex at all when you can't procreate, which is what, but the rhythm method says, well, as long as you're not going to have any kids at this particular moment, it's fine to enjoy it. And her point is that this just shows the deeper point, that it's not that the church is just obsessed with reproduction. It's not that the church just wants to expand its, baptism candidates. It's that they want you to realize that any sex that you do have where there's no reproduction is something that's only a kind of matter of luck. That it's not something that you can claim by right. That it's not something that you can go for intentionally, with design, with the application of your intelligence. I'm going to get this pleasure, and I'm not going to have these side effects. And I should mention that she doesn't spend as much time talking about this, but in the same passage where she first talks about the rhythm method, she also mentions abstinence. And this, I don't know if you've noticed, comes up in the Q&A. Somebody in the Q&A, I almost think that they were trying to ask her a kind of gotcha question, but they didn't realize quite what they were asking. And they asked, what about priestly celibacy? Isn't that the ultimate form of birth control? And I think that maybe they were trying to say, see, the church is okay with birth control. But that's kind of further to her point, because, this just shows that what the church is not aiming at is just kind of mass procreation of Catholics. If they were, they'd want the priests, to procreate too. But what is it that's happening with a priest? The priest is renouncing sex, again, for the same reason that the priest or the nun has to understand, in their view, that they're servants of God, and they make a commitment to God, and that means surrendering procreation in this case. And if it's arbitrary who has to reproduce, and who doesn't, that's also further to the point that it's God's arbitrary will that's making, who gets called to a vocation and who doesn't. Looks like we have one question that's come in, but I think we should save that for later. Well, Ricardo's question, I think, is related to something that we're discussing right now.
Yeah.
And he asks, what does Rand mean when she talks about the Catholic Church's sense of life? What does it mean for a non-individual to have a sense of life? What are its components? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, let's say a word about a sense of life. She talks about a sense of life, and you can read, if you're interested in this topic, the central essays to read of Rand's are in the Romantic Manifesto, probably the first 4, at least, essays at the start of that book, including there's philosophy and sense of life, art and sense of life. So she's addressing that topic head on, and she views a sense of life as, in a person's development from childhood into his teenage years, and then sort of coming into adulthood, he forms implicitly conclusions about life, about what life is like, what is possible in life, what is possible to me in this world. And so, as she calls it, so it's a preconceptual, subconscious metaphysics, a view of what reality or life is like, what's possible in it, sort of in general, and then to me specifically. So it's a view of reality from the perspective of yourself, and that a person is forming this. And part of the job of philosophy, if you read, say, Philosophy of Sense of Life from Rand's perspective, is to help a person consciously identify and change, like toss out errors and adopt better views of this implicit view of the world and of himself that he's forming. So to bring it to more conscious awareness and then to really think it through. But that even if a person doesn't do that, they are forming implicitly. So it's a sense of life. It's about a sense of what life is like. And as an individual can have that, an institution is when we're talking about an institution, we're talking about a product of individuals that has a certain integration. It's not just like picking out 8 random people. And in this case, it's individuals across centuries who are working on a project, who are trying to achieve certain goals. And you might say over time, some of those goals change and are modified, but there's a continuity and an integration to it. And for that kind of institution, and I think particularly here, but not exclusively, one that is philosophical in the way that the church is, it adopts a way, and it can be implicit in its functioning, in what topics it focuses on and doesn't. So it has a certain view of life, of man, and of man's place in the world. And if you want a parallel that might be easier to grasp, when we talk about a corporation, like a company, a business's culture, what you're talking of, and that names something like that Facebook has a certain culture, or that Apple or Google has a certain culture. You're talking about a set of rules, norms, principles, often that are not identified. They're not explicitly enunciated anywhere. Nobody could tell you, so what is exactly Facebook's culture? But they could tell you, well, it's very different than Apple's. And they might be able to make some comparisons, but they can't really put it into explicit conscious terms. Yet it's there, and it's enormously influential. I mean, when a person comes to that company, they feel it all around them. This is the culture, and it's pushing me in certain directions and not in other directions. And do I fit into this culture or not? That's the kind of phenomenon she's talking about. And an institution, like a business or like the Catholic Church, can have this sort of thing. And she thinks, to understand what is going on here, you have to think about that aspect of the whole context.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, because there are a lot of people who, when they read Rand and see her saying things like there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals, they have the idea that you therefore cannot talk about such things as culture. Or any kind of other systematic phenomena systematic social phenomena that link people together. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is a question that I've discussed previously. If there's the essay she wrote called "Don't Let It Go," where she talks about the American sense of life. And I've heard people ask, well, how can you talk about the sense of life of a country if we're supposed to be individualists? But yeah, it's an important point that even though it's true that what's ultimately real is individuals, that doesn't mean that there aren't systematic relationships among them and cultures formed out of those relationships. And that's exactly what you would expect to happen, first of all, if you think that philosophy is something that drives sense of life and that philosophy is shared by individuals. And it's especially something that would happen in cultures that are less individualistic. So if you have a non-individualistic philosophy, like the Catholic philosophy, there's going to be a very pronounced Catholic culture. I mean, they all wear the same uniforms and everything. So I think that's a interesting point. Now, what exactly is the Catholic sense of life? That's a trickier question to ask. And I mean, I think you have to study. You have to know the church and read its documents and know its people to do that. I myself was raised Catholic, and I've got a pretty good sense of it at this point, but I would still be hard pressed to try to communicate it.
And let's connect this to the issue of evidence for the motive of the church.
Yeah.
In that, I want to make a specific point about what she's doing here, and then a wider point of the way I think she looks at the world. So we said a bit earlier that part of the cultural context here is these two encyclicals that seem to contradict each other. And it's, I mean, this is part of what the whole debate was about. Well, the more liberal, and here sort of on the political cultural, could liberal people could accept the first encyclical because it's pro-socialism, pro-collectivism, pro a one-world government has to take control. And that, at this time, is still their ideological framework. Again, whether or not they would explicitly say that it resonates, that, yeah, we can accept this fits our worldview. But then you have an encyclical saying, well, but you can't use any form of artificial birth control, and this doesn't fit in it. Like, what do we do with this? And there's a similar, in another direction, contradiction for the more political conservatives. And her point is, there's not a contradiction here if you know how to look at the situation. And to look at the situation is not to ignore what the Pope is saying in writing. And you'll notice how often she quotes the encyclical. But it's how to interpret that. And you can't just interpret it as doctrines divorced from the whole institution and its centuries of functioning. And you have to think of it in that context. And why particularly about motivation? Because I think the answer is because she thinks a common motivation explains what is going on here. So she's using this as, if this is the motivation, what seems contradictory no longer is. And that's part of the explanation that she's offering. And if you read of the Requiem for Man, it often in the article she says, well, this is a contradiction, and the Pope is too smart and too knowledgeable not to know this is a contradiction. And so then you have to, and I think that's the context here too. So it's not just you've got contradictions, you've got someone knowledgeable and smart enough to be able to see that that other people would experience this as contradictory and so on. And he's doing it nevertheless. And then there's the question, well, why would he do it? Why wouldn't he say, well, I've got to change the view here because there's contradictions. And that's when you then think about, well, if there's a goal here that is in common, these wouldn't bother him. And that's part of the whole evidence, I think, that she's, the way she's analyzing the issue.
Would you like to comment perhaps on why it is that the less philosophical audience thinks there's a contradiction? Why it is that the conservatives cluster on one side and the liberals cluster on the other, and does this have something to do with the very mind-body dichotomy that the church is endorsing?
I mean, I think in Rand's view, it does, and she does talk about this kind of issue in other articles. So in Philosophy Who Needs It, a lengthy article on the obscenity cases that the Supreme Court was dealing with. What is it? It's censorship, local and express, I think is the title.
And we're going to be talking about that in another webinar. And
she brings up this kind of issue again towards the end, if I remember, of the article of like this explain. Now we've got these kind of seeming contradictions. How can you explain it? And then she offers an explanation, and that, I mean, putting it here in these terms, the more progressive minded, and if we think of sort of the cultural liberals who are progressive, they're on the side of socialism. They're on the side of the hippies in a certain way and don't care what the hippies are doing. And Rand's view is that they accept the mind-body dichotomy and they give primacy. What is really important to them is issues about the body, but particularly economic issues and controlling the productive life of human beings. And that's why socialism and one world government, and we've got controls over everything and everybody, that's what really animates them. That's what they're about. And we don't care about the spiritual side. And we're ready to leave people to do whatever they want and to decide for themselves, which is why the hippies and their free love, they don't care and even like in a certain kind of way. And that the other side is also accepts the mind-body dichotomy, but wants to control the spiritual element in man, because that's what's really powerful, important. So that's what we have to control. And so they want to control your sex life, they want contraception, abortion, and that whole, as it's put in America today, the cultural wars. Each side wants to control that which they think of as metaphysically important, powerful. That was her analysis, which I think is a pretty interesting analysis. And it explains a lot to think of it in those terms.
They want to control what they regard as metaphysically important, and they only want to leave free what they regard as metaphysically insignificant. And then, if I remember correctly, the way she closes that is by saying that the two sides are coming closer and closer together, because, in fact, the mind and body are integrated, and since they're both united against the mind in one form or another, they end up not wanting freedom in either domain.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I always thought was really fascinating about the present essay, about both of her analyses of these papal encyclicals, that she's seeing that the Catholic Church is opposed to freedom in both domains, in both, so-called spiritual, personal regards, and also in regard to economic, materialistic ones. The Church doesn't believe in freedom because they see that in some way or another the mind and body are integrated, even though they don't advocate that, and so they oppose freedom in every realm. And by the same token, the liberals and conservatives who seem to be at odds with each other in understanding the Church are coming closer to each other in our culture. And you definitely see that now with the kind of collapse of the Cold War alliance, between free marketeers and religious conservatives. The free marketeers are kind of getting kicked out of the conservative movement, certainly out of the Republican Party, and it's getting harder to tell the difference between Republicans and Democrats on lots of issues, and including, by the way, even some of these issues like abortion and free speech, where the liberals used to be more in favor of certain kinds of freedom. They've certainly become not very good defenders of free speech, and probably much worse about free speech these days than conservatives are, interestingly. And even on abortion, which is still their one last vestige of any kind of respect for individual freedom, that's rapidly eroding too. And there's very few so-called liberals today who are willing to stand up for abortion rights on any kind of moral grounds. I wrote a piece about this for New Ideal lately, and there's more in the works. So it's unfortunately prophetic, some of the things that Rand observed back in the 60s with respect to today.
And I said I wanted to make 2 points about the issue of motivation. So one, that she's specifically looking at it here in regard to these papal encyclicals and trying to understand them. In many of these Ford Hall talks, she's doing something like that. Including of what we talked about last webinar, which was the anti-industrial revolution and Apollo and Dionysus. Both of those, she's looking in issues of motivation. And I think there's a special reason why she's focused on issues where to understand it, you have to understand the motivation involved. And that's her wider perspective on what is happening in the world. All of her fiction deals with this. That is central to the story is and here it's the heroes, the protagonists don't understand the motivation of their opponents. And it's a major, major problem for them. You see that in We the Living, that it's not really understood what is communism about and why are people preaching it and what are the leaders actually after. You see something similar in Anthem. This is the protagonist is caught again in a very collectivist, in a state even worse than what's projected in We the Living, which is set in early communist Russia. And there, the protagonist has a certain view of what the leaders of society are about, what they'll respond to. He invents something and he expects a positive reaction and he gets a negative reaction. He does not understand the motivation of his opponents, and it's a real problem. You see that in The Fountainhead, and it's central to the whole of Atlas Shrugged, that the main, and the two characters that you sort of are with from beginning to end, Dagny Taggart and Hank Reardon, Hank doesn't understand his family and what they're after and their goals and what they want from him. Dagny doesn't understand her brother and more generally the whole scheme and system of the looters. And it imperils their whole lives that they don't understand that. And that it's in the stories because Ayn Rand thinks that's what's going on in the world today. There's all kinds of really, really bad things sort of running amok, and people don't understand them because they can't understand the motivations involved. So I think she sees it as a special job of hers to expose the motivation. And that's why it's in all kinds of articles, I think.
That is actually maybe a good way to segue to the next topic that I wanted to discuss, which is some commonalities between this talk and the ones that you two talked about last week. Because last week you were basically discussing Ayn Rand's analysis and critique of the environmentalist movement, which is a movement usually associated with the left wing of politics. Now she's analyzing religious institutions and movements. They're usually associated with something like the right wing, and yet she has so many similar things to say about each of them. One is in regard to philosophic content, and another is in regard to motivation. So the mind-body dichotomy comes up in both of these cases. Last week it came up, I think, in particular in the form of the reason-emotion dichotomy. That's what Apollo and Dionysus was all about. And clearly, kind of the counterculture that she was analyzing was staking out a position on that dichotomy, as is the church, as a result of the mind-body dichotomy here. And you see reason versus emotion coming up in various ways in its view about sex. So it thinks that what it means to use reason and free will is precisely to suppress and resist sexual urges, which are on the emotion side of the dichotomy. And that, the fact that they think of sex in those terms is, of course, one of the main reasons that the main reason that Rand disagrees with their view of sex, that she rejects the idea that these are two opposed forces. She sees them as integrated. She sees sex as an expression of intellectual values. And then as regards motivation, last time we discussed the motivation of the environmentalist movement, that it wasn't just interested in cleaning up water and air so that people could flourish. Instead, she portrayed it as opposed to human flourishing as such, to being opposed to science and technology and industry and prosperity, this kind of nihilistic motivation, not any kind of motivation by positive values. And likewise here with her discussion of the church. It's not that the church just wants to have an abundance of wonderful children for us to all love. It's that they want us to hate sex and life on earth and kind of cower before it. So there's very similar points that she's making about two cultural movements that you wouldn't ordinarily think would have much in common with each other. This is one of the things I find most fascinating about her cultural analysis. And it was definitely one of the things that got me, interested in objectivism and interested in her philosophy as a whole. I'd never seen anybody kind of bring these different strands together in this way.
And it should take, it's really interesting, and it's a really interesting perspective, but it should take a lot, therefore, to convince you that she's right. And she knows that she stands opposed to so many of the doctrines that everyone has accepted and so many of the viewpoints. And she knows that when she's bringing up that this, she thinks, if you look at the situation objectively, logically, and then try to look at the whole context, because she's often bringing in all kinds of things that nobody mentions and nobody discusses. Even with all that, it takes a lot of thinking to think, is she right about that? Is she right about the motivations involved here? And one shouldn't be too quick, either about the environmentalist of thinking that this is, and sort of the genesis of the movement, that this is what is going on with the movement, or here with the Catholic Church. But I think if you're taking Rand seriously, one should take seriously that this is what she's arguing, and she's giving you evidence. Don't just dismiss and say nobody can believe it. And she knows, and this again is all over the fiction, that this is typically what happens, that people can't believe nobody has this kind of motivation or this corrupt motivation, or no one's is really nihilistic in the end. Everyone is out for some, they think it's a value. It might turn out that it's not a value, but everybody's motivated by values in some kind of sense, not by the destruction of values. And she's challenging all of that, and she's challenging it in many particular cases. And then she writes about the whole general phenomenon in the age of envy, which pulls together a lot of these different aspects of the culture and is saying we live in a culture that is racked by envy, and that's a kind of, that is another way of putting, it's racked by a kind of nihilism, to destroy truth and to destroy values. And it's a very strong claim, but if she's right about it, you need to know.
And here's maybe a good place for me to bring in a point that I find really fascinating. If you were unconvinced by the evidence that she offered for the kind of nihilistic motivation of the church in this essay, or if you heard it at the talk for the first time in the 60s, if you were unconvinced then, what further evidence could you need than the Catholic Church sex abuse crisis that happens then, that is revealed rather in the 80s and 90s? There's this line that she quotes in this in the talk from Atlas Shrugged: "Only the man who extols the purity of a love devoid of desire is capable of the depravity of a desire devoid of love." I can't think of a better, more poetic illustration of that idea than the sex abuse crisis. You might have read this back in the 60s and said, well, I get how she's saying that they extol the purity of a love devoid of desire, but where's the evidence that they are capable of the depravity of desire devoid of love? Well, that's exactly what we found was happening among, all too large subset of priests. You can't get a better example of a depravity of a desire devoid of love when it's desire for, prepubescent kids and who you can't possibly have any values in common with, and who you're manipulating and usually lying to and saying things like, this is, God's test for you, and he's punishing you for your sins. And that's utter nihilism, and destroyed a lot of people's lives because of it. And who would have guessed? She might have guessed back then, but
yeah. And I think if you think of the crisis, part of what's relevant and if you're thinking of the church as an institution, and to go back to the issue of a sense of life of an institution. So this is the sex abuse is enormous, like it's enormously wide through the church when you look at the actual. So it's not like one person here and one person there. It's all over the institution. And the predominance of the evidence is careful attempts to hide it all and to brush it aside. And think if you're a member, like think if you're a company and it's cooking the books, it's cheating customers, and everybody at the company knows something is going wrong, but you're not supposed to say anything, you're not supposed to do anything. So that creates a whole atmosphere that is, that has a profound effect on someone. And this is so I don't think she would be surprised by this huge scandal, because she has a view of what its sense of life is. And if this is what the institution is doing, and particularly this is what it's teaching and pushing in regard to sex, that you have something, she may have been startled by the size of the crisis, but I think this is both, it's in thinking of an institution, its sense of life, it pushes in this direction, and the way it deals with the crisis enforces a certain sense of life within the whole institution. That would be, like, I can't imagine working in the Catholic Church.
If people haven't seen the movie Spotlight, they should go see it, and it's a fairly straightforward account of what really happened in Boston, and the way that these kids were pulled in through various rationalizations that were readily available by the church, and incidentally, the cover up, the Catholic philosophy comes ready-made with a built-in explanation and justification for that cover-up, which is original sin. We're all sinners. This is what we do, and you can't lose faith just because we human beings are sinners. And there's a greater good that we were trying to accomplish for the Holy Mother Church, and so we had to brush it aside. Of course, not when it got so out in the open. And that says something about the very idea of original sin, that it so easily justifies immorality, or at least easily excuses it. If you think people have no free will and are, and they don't, of course, say that, but if that's what it amounts to. Right. If you think everybody's a sinner and they can't avoid it, then it does make it easy to excuse all kinds of evil and immorality. Especially when you can then get it forgiven if you go to the right kind of penance after confession, which is again just part of the idea that God's mercy is inexplicable, and the church is the vessel for that. I should also mention another contemporary data point along these lines, which is the church recently came out with a revision to its policy on the death penalty. And incidentally, one thing that people noticed is that it did this right around the time that the sex abuse crisis was reaching ahead in a number of Latin American countries, where there was a real big scandal brewing of the same kind that's happened everywhere else around the world, but this is just the next domino to fall. And some have alleged that this is just a way of distracting people from that scandal, and there might be something to that. But the way in which, especially conservative culture, and I'm writing a piece about this right now, the way that conservative cultural commentators have reacted to this is symptomatic of the same kind of thing we've been discussing, that the church, there's a contradiction, they think, in the church's position, and they can't understand it. This time, it's not a contradiction with another principle, but a contradiction with their past practice and their past doctrine. The church used to justify the death penalty on pretty solid grounds. Then it got kind of wishy-washy and said, well, we can justify it in exceptional cases. Now they've come out saying it's basically never justifiable. And the conservative Catholics say, how can it be that the church was wrong then and right now to be against the death penalty. But here I think, again, if you think about the motivation that's in common among all of these different time periods and the different positions taken during them, it's probably not an accident, I would argue, that, the church was in favor of the death penalty when it was in charge. It was in favor of the death penalty when it had political power. And now it's against it because it doesn't. And in each case, it's the position is an expression of the idea that the secular powers and secular individuals should be, subordinate to the church. And so in years past, when it advocated the death penalty, people should be subordinate to the church when it commands them to die. Now it should be subordinate to the church when it tells them not to practice some kind of policy because it's afraid of the political power of secular regimes. At least I think that there's an argument you can make for that, something like that being the explanation, and it's quite consistent with this overall philosophical idea that people should pay attention to the church, bow down to it, and bow down to the God that it is the voice of. I don't know, what do you think about that?
There's a real sort of centuries-wide perspective of the church that Ayn Rand comments on, that it thinks in terms of centuries. And she puts it, so this is in, I think, Requiem for Man, she puts it something like, the church has never given up its desire to wield political power. So it's never accepted the separation of church and state and wants state subordinate to church. And so there is an element, I think, of going on here. It's that we're the people who decide who lives and dies, not secular authorities, secular power. You don't, absent connection and a direct line to God, you can't be doing that. Who are you to be doing that? So there's an element. And in most of I think what the Catholic Church does, there's an element of who are you to be asserting yourself here? And that is in this encyclical as well. So to go back, and you can look if you want to take now some of these wider questions, Ben. But to go back to the issue of motivation, and then I think we should say something about Rand's positive view of sex, because this is part also of why I think she thinks this is such a big issue. The development of contraception in the 20th century is an enormous boost to the pursuit of happiness. And so we'll talk about that. But in terms of motivation, if one's thinking like what she's doing and trying to find the motivation is like, this is inexplicable, so we need to look into the Pope's childhood and what at 10 happened to him in schools. That's not what she's doing, and she would object to doing that. It's rather take seriously what is being said and look at what is being said from also a motivational perspective. Like, why would someone be saying this? What does it accomplish? And this is, she once in a while brings up from the villain in the Fountainhead Toohey. Don't bother to examine a folly. Ask yourself what it accomplishes. And her view is not, don't ever examine follies, but one of the ways to look at them is to ask, what is it accomplishing? And it helps you understand the whole phenomenon. But throughout this encyclical, you'll find things that in effect say, and close to explicitly saying, that what we are against is anybody thinking of sex as an end in itself. And here from, this is paragraph 13 in the encyclical, but what's on the Vatican site now, the translation is a little different from what Ayn Rand is quoting, but just this is what the Pope writes. But to experience the gift of married love while respecting the laws of conception, and these are supernatural laws of conception, is to acknowledge that one is not the master of the sources of life, but rather the minister of the design established by the Creator. Just as man does not have unlimited dominion over his body in general, so also and with more particular reason, he has no such dominion over his specifically sexual faculties. And then it continues from there. But that is this same kind of thing. Who are you to think you can decide how to use your sexual faculties? We're the ones who decide that. We're the ones who could. And the issue of sex in life is a profound issue. To renounce it is to renounce that, yeah, I'm not the one who sets the goals. I'm not an end in myself here. I can't view myself as this is integral to the pursuit of happiness. This is all subordinate to God's plan. I'm supposed to be the minister to that. And that's supposed to be my whole orientation. And he tells you this explicitly. But what Ayn Rand does is take that seriously. Don't whitewash it. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't give 100 qualifications to it. Take it seriously that this is what is meant, that you don't have dominion over your sex life. God does. And her translation of that is, in regard to sex, you cannot view yourself as an end in yourself. You're a means to God's end, which is what the Pope is telling you.
And that end might be the procreative and unitive function for some people, but obviously in the case of the religious, the people who have religious vocations, priests and nuns, there's a different end, and the way that sexual capacities are subordinated as means to that end is by just suppressing them entirely. But it has the same effect.
And it's part of the whole rhythm method. What the Pope, and again, it's in the encyclical, what he likes about the rhythm method is the periods where you want to have sex but can't, and you're frustrating that desire because you shouldn't indulge in it. And so, and it's to turn you against your sexual desire. That's why that form of and he's telling you that's why that form of contraception is allowed, because okay, you're not engaged in procreation, but you are engaged in something, and that's battling against your own sexual desires, and that he views, yeah, that is good, and that's how you start to not like sex.
It's interesting. I've read that this encyclical, even though the official author was Paul VI, that someone who had a lot to do behind the scenes with the writing of it was, well, his name at the time was Karol Wojtyla, but then he subsequently became known as John Paul II, who was, of course, a kind of world historical figure at a certain point in the 80s and the 90s, and among other things, authored yet another encyclical, this time on the topic of abortion. We'll probably say a little bit more about that because I see there's some questions coming in about abortion. He wrote an encyclical called The Gospel of Life, Evangelia Vitae. And that's connects together a number of these positions on abortion and the death penalty and euthanasia, but all coming very much from the same perspective. Now, interestingly, I recently learned a little bit about how John Paul's extended work on theology included a series of lectures that he gave called The Theology of the Body, which is very interesting to examine because it's all about Catholic sexual theology and sexual ethics. And you get the sense from it that he has heard too many people say that the church is anti-sex, and that he's trying to soften the kind of impression that people get by softening the rhetoric around sex that conveys this very stark mind-body dichotomy. And so, for example, he argues that sex isn't just a bodily function, that it's got both a physical and a spiritual dimension to it. And so you read this thinking, oh, well, is the church getting better? Is it, and because of that, is it maybe going to change some of its moral advice about the role of birth control. But no, even though there's a lot of very pretty rhetoric about the spiritual aspect of sex, notably missing from any of that is the pleasure. And what he sees as the spiritual function of sex is precisely what you would expect, that in exercising both these unitive and procreative functions, the couple signify their devotion to God, and that's the spiritual dimension of sex. But that's exactly what Rand is talking about when she says there's no better way to generate impotence than thinking about sex as a duty. So he's come up with a way to make this duty premise sound more rhetorically flowery, and he wants to combat the idea that he's a Manichaean who just sees the forces of dark against the forces of light. But it still comes to the same thing. Yeah. And I should also mention, and this is a bit more speculative on my part, but there was an article that was published in the New York Times back in the late 80s, early 90s, saying that the Pope Pope John Paul II generally ignored American culture. There was one major book from American culture that he did read, and that was Atlas Shrugged. And so I sometimes wonder if he read this and thought, that's not my position, that's not my view of sex. I don't think sex is as evil as they say that I think it is. And so tried to whitewash his position in this way later on because of that. That's speculative, but we do know he read the book, and we do know that he did this whole series of lectures on sexual theology.
So let's say a word, because we brought this up, and I think this is important, both that it's in the Encyclical, and then just thinking of cultural debates about, so you get a picture of what, in the Encyclical, of what the Pope thinks a proper approach to sex is, particularly sex in marriage, but it's like that's where sex should be happening for this kind of view, I think. And you get the contrast that what's the alternative? And the alternative, and it's not put in the language of the hippies and what is going on at the time, certainly in America, but wider than that in the Western world, in the period of the 60s and early 70s and into the early 70s, of this kind of rampant promiscuity and free love. But free love here, importantly, I think what it means is love without any standards, without any discrimination. And that's part of the promiscuity aspect of it. And you can read or listen to Apollo and Dionysus, and some of this comes up when she talks about Woodstock, and they're interviewed about the sort of approach and attitudes towards sex. And you can get just there a glimpse. You could read much more about and watch many documentaries on the 60s and see this. So it's either it's a duty, it's controlled by God, it's all for his plan, or there's no standards, it's completely indiscriminate. And the debate's always like, you don't want that, right? So you have to accept my alternative. And it can work in the other way, that look, something's really wrong with the religious approach to sex, so why are you bringing any standards or any moral values and so on into sex? It should just be whatever you want to do and totally indiscriminate. And Rand's position is both of these are wrong, and indeed, in the end, I think both are crazy, in the sense that both destroy all the genuine values that are involved in sex. And as she puts it here, she views sex as good, as important, and therefore you should think about how you approach it. And there's no concrete bound rules of you can't have sex if you're not married, and that religion pushes, but nor is it then just a free-for-all, because the experience is an experience of an expression of your own value and an experience of your own value. So she does not at all have the kind of Platonic view that love and sex are part of the their purpose is to complete you, that you're somehow imperfect, and what you're seeking is some kind of union that will make you perfect. And there's language of this in the encyclical. It's rather that you already value yourself, and you're seeking to both express that value and experience it in a unique form of a partner who you value and who reflects your own values, that you see yourself in them and in the way that they respond to you. And that's what makes it such an distinctive and indeed unique phenomenon, that it's an experience of yourself in a deep, profound way, and that this is really important. But you can only realize that is that kind of experience if you're selective about the partner and about what the relationship really is, and you're both approaching it seriously. Seriously doesn't mean you have to get married, but you have to treat it as if this is a serious aspect of my life and I'm seeking something. And so you get here sort of a sketch, and you can read other things of Ayn Rand's, particularly I think Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, for her what a proper relationship or relationships look like. But you get a third alternative here that is radically different from the two that you say. It's, well, you don't want to be a hippie, so you have to have a religious approach, or you don't want the religious approach, so the alternative is the hippies of the 60s.
So, Onkar, what would you say in response to the conservatives writing today who take a look at our contemporary culture and who point to things like the hookup culture on college campuses, and then all of the rape accusations that this is thought to have spawned, and who say this is what happens when you abandon the religious approach to sexual morality? Is there, first of all, do you agree that things in our culture are as bad as they say that they are? And second of all, why do you think they are? If so, is there anything to what they're saying? Is it maybe that these people have abandoned one and have abandoned the morality of the church and embraced the hippie morality or the hippie anti-morality without any consideration of an alternative? What would you say?
I mean, there's a lot there. I don't think it's as bad as they portray it to be. And again, in thinking of these debates, there's a real interest in portraying it as like, this is what everyone's doing, because then it's like, and that's crazy. So why wouldn't you have a little more sympathy to my religious approach? Whereas if so there definitely is a hookup culture, but is that the whole of the college or university experience? I don't think so. And part of what is important in thinking about contraception, birth control, and having this kind of control over your lives, I don't really care if somebody abuses it. It's like, if they don't have standards and values in their whole approach to sex, it doesn't have an impact. I can still have standards and value, and not religious standards about. I can do, and contraception gives you so much control over this that previous generations and in previous centuries, it's hard to think about sex when there was not reliable contraception, and what it was like, and the fear of that this might result in pregnancy. So you're in a very different context when you're thinking sort of pre the readily available different forms of contraception, and it makes it easier to pursue sex as an end in itself. That some people will then pursue it indiscriminately and so on. Yes, that is it. But so in sort of in this political context, and in thinking about contraception is an unequivocal good, I think, even if people abuse it. Just like cars are, even if some people drive themselves off the road. And I mean, okay, that's what they do. So you asked that sort of just them portraying it as this is, oh yes, but there is an aspect of, and this is, I mean, I think this is also Ayn Rand's view, and there's a lot, including a lot in these Ford Hall Forum talks, that we're at a state of cultural bankruptcy. And bankruptcy here means much deeper than political. It means moral and philosophical bankruptcy. So nobody has real standards, that they can explain. So I don't think people are generally, if you're thinking of Americans, are all indiscriminate in their sex life. But could they articulate what it is that they're looking for in a partner and why? And so the way they've been taught to articulate these things is all wrong. Love is selfless, and then you just give yourself to the other person. And that's not what they actually do, I think, but it's the way that they will describe it. So there's a vast, so there's just an intellectual bankruptcy, but then there is a lowering of standards and of values and of taking yourself seriously. And if you don't take yourself seriously, I don't think you can take the whole a sexual relationship seriously. Because it's to say, I mean, from the fountain, to say I love you, one must first know how to say the I. And the less there's that in a culture, the less there's healthy sexual relationships.
And it's interesting too, because even though there is this hookup culture today, it's not like the hippies. It's not like the free love movement anymore. I mean, as one important data point is the stress on safe sex. So this is interesting because people are very concerned with protecting their bodies in sex, and this is ever since the AIDS crisis in the 80s. This has become a big thing for people. And one of the things you're going to be talking about in a future webinar, the one on our cultural value deprivation, if I remember correctly,
yes,
is there's a line in that speech about how people will take every measure they can think of to ensure their hygiene for their body and their appearance and so forth, but they never think about the standards of hygiene in effect for their consciousness. And that's precisely the issue that you're getting at when you say that you reference the point, to say I love you, you first must learn to say the I, that the standard of value that Rand thinks needs to be brought into not just sexual ethics but all ethics is the needs of a rational consciousness. And so people do care enough to worry about their body and about the safe sex aspect of that, but they're not thinking about what counts as safe sex for the soul, in effect. That would be a good book title if somebody wants to write that.
Yeah, for sure there's connections to our cultural value deprivation and sort of the wider issues that you're bringing up there. We're at an hour and 15 minutes, so we probably should start to wind down, but also think, so what questions have we got? Is there anything we want to take up? You want to take up the one about abortion?
I could take a stab at it. Someone asks a question about when do the rights of the infant begin? Is it okay to kill the baby once it's out, but still bounded by the umbilical cord? So just context for this question is that in this essay and this speech, Rand does reserve a small amount of time talking about the abortion issue, which is something that comes up in Humanae Vitae and elsewhere in Catholic teaching. They're obviously against it. She's in favor of abortion rights, and one of the things that she says in this essay about it is that a child cannot begin to acquire any rights until it is born. And this is something that she elaborates on elsewhere in greater detail, especially in different Q&As that she's done. So if you get Robert Mayhew's book, Ayn Rand Answers, there's a lot of interesting stuff on her position on abortion in there. And I'll just say briefly in response to this specific question, that it is important for Rand that one important prerequisite for the possession of individual rights is physical and physiological individuation. And so that's part of the reason why she talks about not being able to acquire any rights until birth. Now, what exactly do you count as birth? Do you count it as a certain way out of the woman? You have to cut the cord? I mean, I think these questions are sort of beside the point, because they imagine that rights are a kind of magical attribute that is endowed at a magical moment in time, and then it's our job to figure out what that time is. And that's really missing the point, because there's nothing magic about the concept of rights. And in fact, we do have to draw lines, and this is a broader issue in epistemology, the borderline case problem of where do you draw lines in the application of principles and the application of concepts. And it's important that our concepts and principles are human creations, and we have to make decisions. But there's a range in which it's right to draw the line, and a range outside of which it's wrong. And I think that, depending upon the legal framework, the country that you're living in, there are going to be different places you could draw it. But that's not a philosophical issue anymore. That's becomes a legal issue, maybe becomes a cultural issue in certain ways. But the principle is that a child can't acquire rights until it's born, because at a certain, up until that time, its existence is taxing on the mother and sometimes a threat to the mother, and her rights come first. She's the only one with the full-fledged rights of an adult human individual. And, wherever you draw the line, you have to make sure that those rights are not threatened. And I have a piece coming out, by the way, sometime soon on various arguments that are often made from science by anti-abortion critics. And I'm not going to touch on this particular issue, but if you're interested in that kind of question, you might be interested in some of the things I'll discuss in that article. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's good. There's another question. Well, it's sort of a question. It's a claim. Maybe the question is, do you agree with this? It was posted on the chat, so it's not quite a question, but it's worth commenting on, I think. So the hippie morality, Dale posted this, is more a result of the hyper-strict forbiddance approach to sex of the Church, of the Catholic Church, rather than something for which the Church's attitudes are the cure. So I definitely agree with the latter part. The Church's attitudes are not a cure here. But I think, yes, in looking at the causality involved, particularly in Western culture and in American culture, religion pushes a certain view of sex, including that the alternative is animalistic desires devoid of reason and values, particularly moral values. And you can view certain outbreaks like the hippies as sort of a blind rebellion against that, sort of that attitude towards sex. But it's a blind rebellion. That's important. And in this kind of way, too, I think she thought of the hippies as products of the establishment, not rebels. So blind rebellion, it's not a real rebellion. They're accepting what they've been taught and just taking the other side of it as so you say the choices are, it's got to be duty, dogmatic, only within marriage, and so on, or it's animalistic. And, okay, we'll take animalistic. That's not a rebellion against anything. That's letting them set all the terms and then just, so it's as in the Fountainhead, there's pseudo-individuals who just do something different for the sake of it being different, and that is not individualism from the Fountainhead's perspective. So here, if you just take the other side of what someone's saying, that's not a rebel. A rebel, in Rand's view, and I think in the right view, is a radical, that they go to the root and they would rethink. So Ayn Rand's a rebel here, because she rejects both alternatives and says you shouldn't live either of these ways. Here's a different approach. And then she champions and argues for that.
I should say that I live in New Orleans, which is a very Catholic city, and they have these bouts of rebellion every year, and it's Mardi Gras, and it's not an accident, I don't think. Yeah. And then Ash Wednesday happens the very next day, and they're all in church again, and the cycle continues and flipping back and forth. There's a really, I think, a poetic, artistic illustration of this issue. I think if you've ever seen the movie Chocolat, there's a character who's a priest, and spends the bulk of the movie preaching against this chocolate shop and its pagan influences and that they opened up during Lent and so forth. And then at a certain point, he's I can't remember exactly what occasions it. He feels betrayed by somebody, and he goes on a kind of a hedonistic rampage through the shop. He breaks the window down. He eats all the chocolate. He's covered with it. He sleeps through it. It's exactly the same kind of animalistic rebellion. That's what you would expect when you see when you think that that's the alternative.
Yeah. And again, in terms of motivation, I think Rand's view is they actually want that to happen, and then that there's guilt afterwards, that you feel guilt. That part of the control is that oh yeah, you have an animalistic nature, you will give in to it at some point. So that's a sin. It would be great if you could resist it all, but that's a sin you should feel guilty for, and you should come to us for penance.
Dale corrects me in the movie. It's not the priest; it's the mayor. But yeah, it's the mayor who's been preaching on religious grounds the virtues of repressing one's pleasure during Lent. I think we've touched on all of the questions that I wanted to touch on. Did you have anything? Did anybody have any last questions? We're going to close things up otherwise. Anybody online, on Facebook, or on Zoom? Okay. Not seeing any others. I think we can shut things down, and I'll remind you all that we will be meeting again. This time it will be Aaron Smith and me this coming Wednesday at the same time. We'll be discussing global balkanization. The topic of that is the spread of tribalism around the world, which I think is a topic that could not be more relevant in this day and age. Also the topic of our fall student conference. So if you're a student and you're interested in coming to that conference, you might want to check out this session. Certainly check out the recording, check out the global balkanization talk and essay. So this was fun, Onkar.
Yeah.
We'll talk with you again soon.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.